Counter-terrorism today. Up-to-date analysis with Dan Diker.
Welcome, everyone. This is a special edition of Counter-terrorism today. I'm Dan Diker, and this is IDC International Radio 106.2 on your FM dial. We have a very unusual program for you today. This is a sneak preview on the upcoming ICT's World Summit on Counterterrorism. It's the 15th annual International Conference on Counterterrorism, September the 7th to the 10th, 2015. It's right around the corner. This is a sneak preview. You know, the ICT, the International Institute for Counterterrorism here at the IDC, Herzliya, Interdisciplinary Center Herzliya, is the leading agenda setter for the counterterrorism agenda internationally. And that's why it's held here. And this year, the conference is called the Shifting Sands of Terrorism. And there probably is no better title to describe the shifts in terrorism networks, the shifts in players and actors, the shifts in the ability and lack of ability of state actors and non-state actors to govern the macro international economic, social, political, and legal response of the international community to these shifting sands of terrorism. Well, you know, we want to jump right in and bring probably the best possible person to give us an overview. This is the brainchild of Professor Boaz Ganor, who's with us, who's on the line here. And Professor Ganor, of course, is the chairman of the of the ICT's World Summit on Counterterrorism. He is the Ronald Lauder Professor of Counterterrorism, and he is the dean of the master's program here at the Lauder School of Government, actually, here at the IDC, and he's also the executive director and founder of the International Institute of Counterterrorism. Professor Ganor, it's a pleasure to have you here on Counterterrorism today. To give us the bottom line is what the shifting sands of terrorism mean in 2015 and why this conference is so vital.
Thank you very much, Dan, for having me in your program. Well, you know, counterterrorism is always a very relevant subject matter, but I believe that in these troubled times in the Middle East and in the global arena, counterterrorism has become a must in reference of trying to understand the processes, the changes, the tectonic changes which are happening, and the challenges in countering those phenomena. When we analyze the coming conference, which is going to be held at IDC next week, and our listeners are of course invited, we brought to Israel, and we brought from Israel the best speakers and the best experts and the best minds that will analyze all of those very interesting and troubling changes. To give you an example, we have a session of discussing Hamas between Fatah and the Salafists. We see what is happening in the Palestinian arena in general, what is happening in Gaza Strip in particular. And we know Hamas being a hybrid terrorist organization, but we should understand Hamas today in between those two ends of the same range. On one hand, he has the Fatah organization, which is the traditional enemy, I would say, the secular nationalist enemy of Fatah, of Hamas. But in the recent years, we see the rise of another enemy from the other side of the range, and this is the Salafists, the Islamist jihadists that are challenging Hamas from the Islamist point of view. How does Hamas deals with that? What will be the outcome of these clashes? Another example is Hezbollah. Hezbollah, the title that we gave to the session on Hezbollah is "Can the enemy of my enemy be my friend?" We see a very interesting and dangerous, I would say, trend in the Western world, in which they identify ISIS as one of the biggest threats for the security of the whole world. And since those Islamist Salafists, the ISIS activists, are fighting, among others, Iran and Hezbollah, then it seems that the international community is starting to give a clearance to Hezbollah and to Iran by falling into this false belief that the enemy of our enemy is our friend, and they might find out that the enemy of their enemy is a worst enemy of theirs.
Well, Dr. Ganor, Professor Ganor, this is one of the major concerns that many people, observers and analysts alike, have about the Islamic Republic of Iran. Those that are pushing this current, as we speak, this current pact between Iran and the P5+1, which I'm sure will come up throughout the conference, they think that the enemy of my enemy can be my friend. And there are others that think, no, wait a minute, they can't be my friend.
You're definitely right, and you should bear in mind that the conference is being conducted 1 week before the American Congress is going to vote on the Iranian deal. So the relevancy of this discussion is crucial because let alone the questions that has to do with the nuclear efforts of Iran, no doubt that this deal would intensify their involvement and their capabilities in the field of terrorism worldwide, and this is exactly what our experts need to discuss in this session and other sessions. To give you another example, then, on discussions that are going to be held is a panel that will deal with ISIS, with the Islamic State, and will try to analyze the future of global jihad in reference to the competition between traditional global jihad, i.e. Al-Qaeda, and ISIS. And we see in the recent months and even a year or two that Al-Qaeda is declining and ISIS is growing on the account of Al-Qaeda. That's a very interesting discussion from our point of view. We have sessions which will deal with cyber terrorism, with de-radicalization, ideologies, and also from an Israeli perspective, the connection between the delegitimization and the BDS campaign against Israel and questions of counter-terrorism. On the face of it, it seems that those are two different subject matters, but when you analyze the criticism which is being posed toward Israel by the delegitimizers, you would see that many, if not most, of the claims, the false claims against Israel, has to do with counterterrorism and defensive measures. That's why we think it's very important to discuss that, among other things like the lone wolf phenomenon, which is a growing phenomenon. It's a total different challenge than the question of traditional organized terrorism. It's a new challenge that you need to have new technologies, new doctrines, and new concepts in order to counter this phenomenon.
Well, Dr. Ganor, I'm sitting here with one of your scholars, Dr. Amichai Magen. I think that Dr. Magen is going to jump in and ask your question as well.
Good morning, Boaz. Good to hear your voice.
One of the best scholars that we have. Thank you.
Thank you. There have been media reports in the last few days trying to understand this unprecedented tidal wave of illegal migration, not just from Syria and Iraq, but from through Libya, through North Africa, into Europe. And one of the factors that seem to be pushing this forward is great fear of ISIS and the just horrific conditions, humanitarian conditions that have evolved in North Africa and the Middle East. So the story seems to be evolving, and I wanted to ask you if you have a sense that Europe is beginning to view the situation differently from this time last year, and whether you think this will have any kind of impact on policy in Washington as well as Brussels.
It's a great question, and I'm afraid that I'm very concerned with this process of growing immigration into Europe. I wrote an article about 6-7 years ago. The title of the article was Intifada in Europe. What I did there is quite strange. I try to compare the sociological processes that the Palestinians have experienced in the occupied territories in the West Bank, in Gaza, after 1967, to the sociological situation that Muslim immigrants are experiencing in Europe. Now, it seems as if I'm mixing apples and oranges, or maybe vegetables and fruits, because when you talk about the Palestinians, on the face of it, this is a case that was imposed on them, occupation. And in Europe, this is a voluntary step that they are immigrating to Europe. How can you compare the two? Very interesting to see a lot of similarities. If I need to point out one or two of them, I would say that you see a shifting reaction comparing the first and the second generation immigrants in Europe and the first and the second generation of Palestinians that lived into the situation of occupation in the West Bank and Gaza. What do I mean by that? The first generation of the Palestinians actually were quite happy with the situation that they were under Israeli control and not Jordanian and Egyptian. Their socio-economic situation improved enormously. Unemployment went to zero. And they were quite happy with this situation. The same thing happened with the first generation of immigrants to Europe. They came either looking for political asylum because they were persecuted in their home countries, or in order to improve their socio-economic situation. And just by granting or getting the citizenship of the European country, they accomplished the highest goal of their lives. Second generation is a different ballgame. They born into a new situation. They feel inequality. They feel a second generation, a second class citizens. They don't believe that nobody did them any favor by granting them the citizenship, and therefore this frustration is being tracked by intentionally by Islamist and jihadist organization into terrorism, into political violence, and so on and so forth. The same thing happened with the second generation of the Palestinians that actually gave birth, the second generation gave birth to the Intifada in 1987. And I predict there in my article that this Intifada of the second and the third generation of immigrants in Europe is probably also going to happen in the future. Those waves of immigrants to Europe, and many of them are Muslim immigrants from Muslim countries, Syria and other countries, will fasten this process of growing frustration, if not in the first generation, in the second generation. And in between, of course, there is the threat that you mentioned of foreign fighters infiltrating with the immigrants, coming back to Europe and other Western countries and spread terrorism and violence in those countries as well.
Yeah, so very complicated, pertinent questions. We see growing fluidity between North Africa and the Middle East and the European scene, and this is certainly a theme and a set of issues that we're going to put a big emphasis on during the forthcoming conference. We're going to have a special event for the ambassadors and military and police attaches of the European Union who are based here in Israel, in cooperation with our partners, with the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, exactly on Europe and Israel, the converging terror threats and the imperative for greater cooperation. And of course, we're also going to have a simulation on the threat of returning foreign terrorist fighters to Europe. So I think this is going to be very exciting.
It seems that we're going to be very busy next week in our conference. This is a 4-day conference which starts on the 7th of September up to the 10th of September. I would urge our listeners to join us and sign in the website of ICT to the conference. But those which are incapable of doing that, they can always watch and follow the conference live on the internet on the website of ICT.
Absolutely. Professor Boaz Ganor, the chairman of the World Summit on Counterterrorism, this year's summit, The Shifting Sands of Terrorism. Professor Ganor, the Dean of the Lauder School of Government, as well as the Executive Director and founder of the International Institute for Counterterrorism. Thanks so much for joining us here on IDC Radio on Counterterrorism today on this sneak preview into what should be a fascinating and much-needed conference at this critical moment in the history of the Middle East and the West. Thank you, sir, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
You know, Amichai, when you think about all of the different sessions that are going to take place, what stands out, I think you mentioned it now in this little dialogue, this chat with Professor Ganor, is the sense that there's the metastasizing problem of global jihad of the Sunni or the Shia variety moving into Europe, and the drafting of foreign fighters has accelerated very, very prominently in the last 12 months. I mean, there are thousands, literally thousands and thousands of European and even American, those numbers are in the high hundreds, and even maybe over 1,000 fighters from North America that are being either captured or tracked as they make their way to the what they call the main battlefield of jihad in Syria and Iraq, and some even going to Yemen. What's your sense about that? I mean, here you're really the go-to scholar here for the issue of governance, state governance, and control, and also the same type of challenges to governments of these non-state actors, of these terror organizations. When you look at the foreign fighters and the European phenomenon that you're addressing through the police and other law enforcement officials and security officials that you're having at this lunch, among your other sessions, what's your sense? Is that really the elephant in the room? I mean, is that really the real growing danger that creates lone wolves in all around the world and really allows terrorism to metastasize to dimensions that we haven't seen before?
Well, exactly, Dan. I mean, I think that over the last several years, we've been experiencing a deep crisis of governance in the Middle East, the spread of failed states in important parts of the Middle East, the rise and mutation of terrorist organizations to become actors that control vast amounts of territory, population. We've seen borders becoming more porous, and that allows anti-Western actors such as Iran to become more deeply involved and to stir ethnic violence and civil war in parts of the Middle East. We see this unfolding humanitarian catastrophe and a reduced ability of states in North Africa and the Middle East to actually provide both internal and external security. What's different about 2015 compared to 2014 and 13 is that we're beginning to see the vast negative externalities of those processes, which, in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, kind of evolved in Syria, in Iraq, in Libya, but that is beginning to seep into other parts of the world that has so far maintained stability and peace. And we see that the proximity of Europe to North Africa and the Middle East, the movement of the epicenter of global jihad away from Afghanistan, Pakistan, and towards Syria and Iraq is beginning to affect and to infect those areas in the international system that have known the long peace, that have known peace for 70 odd years. And, Europe is very interesting in this regard. There is the geographical proximity. There is the presence of a local Muslim population, first generation, second generation, that Professor Ganor mentioned. There is the open borders issue. There is the proximity to Turkey and the Balkans. And, of course, the southern Mediterranean and its access to the northern Mediterranean. But I think the big question is going to be not just about Europe, but whether we're going to see this infection and these negative externalities infecting other parts of the international system, and then what's going to be the reaction of Europeans, both internally but also internationally. That's why I think we have some very large, important policy questions that are going to impact not just issues of counter-radicalization, counter-terrorism, but also immigration, borders, and the entire international debate about international security.
When you go into Europe versus going into the United States, my sense is, and maybe I'm a little bit one-sided towards the American experience, having grown up in the United States, but I see the political will of the state system, of the federal government of the United States, as being maxed out, or in a positive sense, in order to defend the borders of the United States from infiltrating terrorists. I know that the New York City Police Department has the finest counterterrorism or urban operation probably in the world, according to high-ranking Israeli security officials. Now, in contrast, that you go to many countries in Europe, and one just doesn't see the overall same type of political will, and even security systems, unless there are so many things going on that we don't know about. And it comes down to the question is what role does political will play in state governance that would contribute either to state success in fending off, fighting, and defeating this terror threat to sovereignty in the West, in the Middle East, versus the lack of political will.
Well, political will is critical for any type of formulation and implementation of policy. But I think we have to remember that this is not a European problem by itself. Just last week, federal agencies in the United States announced the arrest of 64 residents of the United States, many of them citizens of the United States, some of them women, some of them minors, on charges of aiding and abetting ISIS in a variety of ways. So this is not a problem that's confined to Europe. As I mentioned, Europe is affected more immediately and deeply for a number of reasons. One of them is simply geography. Another one is that Europe has undergone a long process of integration, an important part of which is this idea of freedom of movement of people, a borderless Europe. The idea that once you enter the boundaries of the European Union, the 28 member states of the European Union, freedom of movement is guaranteed, and that makes policy, counterterrorism policy, difficult, as we've seen. I think that you're alluding to a deeper and a very, very important set of issues, which is Europe has been living in a way in a sort of Kantian paradise since the end of the Second World War and the process of European integration. The whole European experience of war and violence has taught Europeans not to trust themselves with the application of power and force. And there is a very deep and fundamental debate going on in Europe today, particularly in Germany, which historically has derived the lesson that power in the hands of Germany is a very dangerous thing. There is a fundamental debate today, partly driven by Mr. Putin and caused by Mr. Putin, what's happening in Russia and Ukraine, but increasingly driven by events in North Africa and the Middle East, the immigration crisis, the terrorism crisis, about power and the use of power in Europe. And it seems to me that there is a very important debate beginning to unfold in Europe about whether Europe can afford to continue living in a reality where security is not something that Europeans do, but rather the European sort of free ride on American provided security. We have to remember that the level of military and intelligence spending still, even today in Europe, is extremely low. For the last 70 years, Europe has outsourced its security to NATO and the United States. And the pressures that Europe is under today is beginning a very deep and fundamental debate about how to deal with this new geopolitical reality. There is an historical and a sociological danger in Europe that letting go of the sense of security and peace that Europeans have gotten used to over the last 70 years might lead to a swing of the pendulum in the opposite direction. And we do see the rise in Europe of right-wing, xenophobic political parties. And I think that there's an incredibly important role for European-Israeli dialogue precisely at this time. How can one be patriotic, safeguard liberal democratic values without being xenophobic anti-Semitic, and anti-Muslim. And I think that you, Dan, have a very fascinating session in the conference itself, looking at some of these issues: terrorism, anti-Semitism, the boycott and divestment movement against Israel, whether there's a connection between those issues, and whether we can find a way today, given the convergence of threats in Europe and for Israel, but also for Turkey, also for the United States, whether we can find a way to shift the terms of the debate to make European-Israeli relations much more constructive, rather than dealing with these issues of boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And I think you raised some very fascinating questions about what's the connection, what's the relationship between terrorism in Europe today, radicalization, but also anti-Semitism and the BDS movement.
Well, it's a thank you for that, for your kind words and introduction. I think that Professor Ganor really deserves a lot of credit as a counterterrorism expert to understand that there really is a direct and very important connection between non-military forms of political violence, and you yourself are leading the issue here of political violence at the International Institute for Counterterrorism, as well as the IDC. You teach courses on political violence, and political violence today, Amichai, as you help us to understand here in your eloquent introduction, is just as dangerous as terrorism itself. And Islamic political warfare tells us this from the 7th century. Dr. Harold Rose, one of the great experts here, teaching a course in Israel at the College of Judea and Samaria on Islamic warfare and political warfare and thinking. And since the 7th century, in the tradition of Islamic political warfare, is to downgrade, demonize, delegitimize, and demoralize your opponent before you actually go in for the physical kill. And that is what's happening here in 2015 and in the years past, most prominently after 2000 at the South African-hosted Durban Conference on Xenophobia and Related Forms of Intolerance. That's where the sort of the modern incarnation that we know today took root. And in fact, we are finding a connection in the analysis of BDS and terrorism between Islamic groups such as Hamas, and what they have is social media extensions, political wings of those organizations that operate in Europe, primarily in London, representing the values and the mandate of organizations like Hamas, but also advancing the BDS, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movements against Israel. So you have here, and Dr. Ganor had pointed this out in his comments earlier, and when he talked about hybrid organizations. In a hybrid organization such as Hamas, for example, and Hezbollah, there are political identities to these organizations and terrorist identities to the same organization, and it sends a confounding message to people in the West, particularly in Europe, the Europe that's dealing, as you point out so well, with the issues of human rights, with the issues of peace and security, with the issues of World War II and the misuse of power of which they were guilty, and then they see these terror groups with people by the name of Mo and Shirley and Joe, and they wear nice suits and nice dresses, and they go to the university. They go to different universities in the United States, and they go, well, these aren't terrorists. These are just people acting in their legitimate political demands, and they're doing BDS. Well, at least they're not undertaking terror attacks. And our view is, I think, here at the IDC, I think I can generalize and say that in our analysis, we're finding that this type of political violence is profoundly violent and terror and linked to terrorism, because one feeds the other. So we really have to look and understand the Islamic connection to BDS. It's very, very important. We see it in the United States with Muslim students associations across the United States backing the Muslim Brotherhood, backing the Hamas, backing BDS, and so that the delegitimization of Israel becomes an intellectual and an ethical, in inverted commas, platform in order for terrorists to attack Israel after that. Because if you have no legitimacy, as we know from our World War II experience, and if you have no legitimacy as a state, as they're claiming Israel doesn't, regardless of territorial arguments, then without legitimacy, why not destroy you like they did essentially to apartheid South Africa, and they dismantled it. This is the problem of BDS: is the direct connection to the type of thinking that spawns terrorism against legitimate states.
These are salient points, dealing not only with the tactical and strategic and technological dimensions of terrorism and insurgency, but also with the ideological, ideational, and legitimizing principles and ideology that underlines and that undergirdles this struggle. And I think it illustrates the breadth and the scope of issues that we're going to be dealing with at the conference next week, which is just fascinating and multifaceted and very interdisciplinary as well.
Extremely interdisciplinary, and I think that's what characterizes the Interdisciplinary Center Herzliya, is this interdisciplinary approach to every problem. So you're looking at it from every point of view, 360 degrees. You know, it's funny, Jews at this time during these holidays, the last holiday of this period is called Sukkot. And in Sukkot, people wave a palm. They wave a lulav in 6 different directions in order to encompass all aspects. It's sort of a multidisciplinary act of waving a palm in order to cover every aspect of the universe. And I think in a way, this is exactly really what's happening at the IDC Herzliya. They're waving the lulav of counterterrorism, the palm of counterterrorism in every different direction in order to cover every possible academic, intellectual, political, legal, economic, technical communication aspect of this very serious problem called global jihad, world terrorism. It is a global threat. And Israel certainly has become a global leader, and the IDC as a microcosm of that. And the ICT, of course, the International Institute for Counterterrorism, is taking a leading role in this global confrontation with a terrorism that endangers the future of all of our families and children and neighborhoods, communities and countries. So, with that, I hope we've offered a tempting sneak preview into the bitter taste of terrorism and the shifting
it's just
tenets.
A taste.
It's just a taste.
Yeah.
It's just nice. If you go online to the IDC's website and the ICT's website, which is what is it? Is it listed as ict.org.il? Or go on, put into Google International Institute for Counterterrorism Conference, and I think the whole schedule will come up, and you'll see that this really is the bottom line on understanding, assessing, and even countering, coming up for understanding policy ideas for the West and in the Middle East to counter this type of political violence, insurgency, and terrorist chaotic behavior that really poses a major threat to our civilization as we know it today. And in fact, as we end here, as Professor Ganor said in the very beginning, this conference is taking place in just in the lead up, in the run up to one of the most fateful votes in the history of the United States and probably Western countries in the world, which is the vote of the U.S. House of Representatives against the or in favor or against the pact with the Islamic Republic of Iran, yes or no. So we'll have to wait and see. It's full of drama. Dr. Amichai Magen is senior lecturer at the IDC, and you are the head of the program on governance and political violence at the ICT, the International Institute for Counterterrorism. Thank you for sharing your thinking with us. It's always a pleasure.
Well, thank
to
you for
dialogue with
having
you.
me, Dan. And this is going to be, I think, my 5th conference, and it really is such a rewarding and enriching experience. Typically, over 1,000 people from 60+ countries. It really is a wonderfully stimulating event.
Well, if people can register, they have to register online, or you can see it live online over the internet. But but do check in for a session or 2 or 3. You're bound to learn something. I learned something new every moment being here at the ICT, but clearly this is the conference. If you spend a lot of time focusing on this conference, you'll know more than 99.9% of people in the world about this subject of terrorism, counterterrorism. This has been Dan Diker with you for another edition of Counterterrorism Today, a sneak preview into the 15th World Summit on Counterterrorism, the shifting sands of terrorism, scheduled to take place here at the IDC September 7th to 10th. That's next week, 2015. Shalom from the IDC and the ICT, and to you, Amichai Magen. Goodbye. Thank you.
Counterterrorism Today. Up-to-date analysis with Dan Diker.